The window trembled as I watched my own son, Nathan, unlock the door of the house beside my ruined one. Still, I didn't move. I just pulled the old quilt tighter, letting the cold settle in my bones. As the wind slipped through the cracks, it carried the sound of his laughter. Carefree, distant, undeserved. While he showed his wife the new patio, I traced my finger over the deed he'd forgotten existed. The same draft that chilled me, whispered the truth of what was mine all along. That's when I smiled. My son had built his new life right on his mother's land. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Elaine lay beneath the quilted layers of blankets, her body curling into a tight, trembling knot against the cold. The furnace had sputtered to a halt an hour ago. A final, unceremonious death that sent a shudder through her entire home. The only sound in the house was the howling wind outside, pressing against the thin walls of her neglected refuge. She could feel it, that biting chill, seeping into her bones no matter how many quilts she piled on top. The space around her was empty, save for the silence and the occasional creak of the house shifting in the storm. She'd made her peace with it, the quiet coldness that seemed to be part of the house now, like an old friend. This was the home where her son had learned to walk, where they'd shared Thanksgiving dinners, where everything had fallen apart piece by piece. Now, there was nothing left but this emptiness. The phone buzzed on the table beside her, and she reached for it with stiff fingers. The screen lit up with Nathan's name and a simple text. "Hope you're staying warm." She stared at the words, her chest tightening. That was it. The extent of his care. After everything, after the years of sacrifices, the nights she stayed awake worrying for him, this was the message he'd sent. Elaine didn't respond. Instead, she set the phone back down with a shaky breath. The sound of a moving truck engine rumbled from outside, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled herself upright, her joints aching as she stumbled over to the frost-covered window. The snow was falling in thick, silent sheets, but through the blur she saw the unmistakable silhouette of a moving truck pulling into the driveway next door. Elaine blinked, confused for a moment. Then her heart skipped as the realization hit her. She watched as the truck's ramp lowered and several men began unloading boxes, furniture, his furniture, and stacking them neatly by the front door. Nathan. He never told her. A twinge of bitterness curled in her chest. She watched as a figure stepped out from behind the truck, her grandson, Miles. His small, bundled-up frame was almost lost in the snowstorm, but Elaine could still recognize the way he moved, how his little feet crunched in the snow. He was already halfway up the path, heading into the new house. She stood there, frozen in the cold, not daring to move. Nathan hadn't told her he was buying the house next door. It wasn't the house she'd expected him to pick. No, Nathan had always preferred newer things, nicer things, bigger things. But this was different. This house, the one they'd lived beside for years, held too many memories, too many ghosts. He didn't even bother to let her know. A soft knock at the door broke her from her thoughts, but she couldn't move at first. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows. She opened the door just a crack, and there, standing in the snow with the phone pressed to her ear, was Trudy. "You still own that lot on the side?" Trudy's voice was thick with curiosity and something else. Amusement, maybe. Elaine felt a shiver pass through her, but this time it wasn't from the cold. "I think so," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Think so? Elaine, you either do or you don't. Go check." Trudy's tone turned serious. "You've got a lot more power than you realize." Elaine stared at the empty space where her son's new house now loomed, and a quiet rage began to stir inside her, bubbling under the surface. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted it. But it seemed like the universe was handing her something, whether she was ready for it or not. Her mind raced. The small parcel of land between their houses. It was insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But in this moment, it felt like a tether, a lifeline she hadn't known she needed. She looked out the window one last time at Miles, disappearing into the house next door. He didn't even glance back. Elaine felt a hard knot form in her throat as she closed the door quietly, then shuffled toward the small stack of old paperwork she kept in the kitchen. Her hands moved with a familiarity she hadn't realized she'd retained. Papers, maps, deeds. She pulled out the county records with trembling fingers and glanced down at the old document that proved she still owned the narrow strip of land between the houses. A small, crooked smile spread across her face as she turned back to the window. "So, you think you can just buy up everything next to me and leave me out of it, Nathan?" She didn't need his permission. And it was about time someone reminded him of that. A storm had been brewing, and it wasn't just outside. Elaine's hands shook as she pulled the county records from the stack of paperwork, the yellowing pages stiff with age. The room felt colder now, but it wasn't the snowstorm outside that made her skin tighten. It was the realization that her grip on what was left of her life, and her power, was slipping into place. Her son had thought she was invisible, like the house, like the lot beside it, but she wasn't. She unfurled the deed, her fingers tracing the neat legal description that confirmed what she'd suspected. The narrow strip of land between their houses, where the fence, the patio, and now the life her son had chosen to build, was still hers. Nathan's new house had come with a lot of decisions, but somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten to check where the property lines really fell. The edges of her lips curled upward, a bitter smile forming that didn't reach her eyes. It wasn't much, just a sliver of land, hardly noticeable unless you were looking. But in the chaos of his new life, it was the one thing Nathan hadn't accounted for. The one thing he'd forgotten. Trudy's voice crackled in her ear, steady and calm despite the storm outside. "That's encroachment, Elaine. He's built right on your property, without asking, without even thinking about it." "Want to stir the pot?" Elaine's chest tightened, but it wasn't fear that twisted inside her now. It was something else. Something cold and calculated, sharp enough to cut through the warmth of her old memories. She had been silent for too long, too patient. And now, with the faintest trace of a spark, she could feel her purpose forming like ice around her heart. It was time for him to see what she was capable of. She stepped to the window, pressing her palm against the frost and watching through the haze. Nathan's new fence, tall and modern, jutting out from the side of his house, a crude line cutting across the land she'd lived beside for decades. His patio extended past it, neat rows of stones neatly arranged over what should have been her soil. It wasn't just a simple mistake, it was a disregard for her, for everything she had sacrificed. Her fingers curled around the camera she kept by the door. She hadn't used it much since the days when the house had been full, when the pictures had been taken with the lens pointed at Smiles. Now, it was her weapon. She clicked the button, each image capturing the boundary line Nathan had crossed, the fence, the patio, his carelessness, now documented. Her legal grounds made clear. She heard a voice from outside, and through the haze of the window, she saw Kara walking across the yard. The woman's smile was as thin and practiced as ever, her movements crisp in the cold. Elaine stood still, watching as Kara passed, pretending not to notice the subtle shift in her posture when she saw Elaine standing in the window. Kara waved, her voice too loud against the quiet of the snow. "Didn't realize anyone was still living over there," she called, the words tinged with condescension. Elaine's gaze didn't leave her as she replied. "Funny," she said, her voice steady. "I never left." Kara's smile faltered for a moment, a flash of something, maybe surprise, before she quickly straightened, forcing her expression back into something polite. Elaine didn't bother to watch as Kara hurried away, her boots crunching in the snow, her shoulders a little too tense. The cold in the house seemed to be growing, but it wasn't the furnace that had died this time. It was the warmth of the life she'd once known, the life Nathan had taken with him when he left. But now Elaine knew there was something he hadn't accounted for, something that was hers, and always had been. The camera clicked again, capturing the fence from another angle. The property line clearly visible now in the photographs she would present. She could already see it, the letters to the zoning office, the papers she would file. This wouldn't be a quiet, invisible battle. No, this would be loud enough for Nathan to hear. Loud enough for him to realize just how much he'd underestimated her. Elaine set the camera down, her heart steady as she surveyed the land from the window. The snow continued to fall, thick and silent, but her mind was clear. She had a plan now, and it would be as unyielding as the land she stood on. Elaine stepped into the quiet, polished lobby of Eldergrove Bank, the cold from outside still clinging to her coat and the hem of her scarf. The building was modern, gleaming under the low light that filtered in through tall windows, a far cry from the worn floors and cracked walls of her home. Everything in here was designed to look pristine, untouched by time or the harsh winds of reality. But as Elaine walked toward the back office where Trudy and Rebecca were waiting, she felt none of the comfort that came with such places. Instead, there was a tightness in her chest, the weight of the truth she was about to confirm pressing down on her. Trudy stood by the desk when Elaine entered, her lips curled into a knowing smile, but her eyes alert, focused. Trudy's presence always made Elaine feel like she could take on the world, like there was more beneath her skin than the years of loneliness she'd hidden behind. Trudy had been with her through everything, the losses, the quiet bitterness, and the slow unraveling of dreams. Now, she was ready to help her turn it all back around. Rebecca Ives sat across from Trudy, the quiet zoning officer's stern face softened slightly by the familiarity of their conversation. She leaned forward slightly when Elaine entered, her hand resting on a stack of maps. "Elaine," Rebecca said with a nod, "you're on time." "I made sure of it," Elaine replied, the words sharper than she intended. She sat down, her fingers restless on the edges of the chair, as though trying to steady herself. Rebecca shuffled through the papers on the desk before placing a map in front of Elaine, a map with clear boundary lines drawn in black ink. "Nathan's renovation," she began, glancing at Trudy before meeting Elaine's gaze. "It crosses over. He's encroaching on your land. Not by much, but enough. I'll file the violation, but you'll need more than that." Elaine looked down at the map, her heart thumping in her chest. Nathan's house, his pristine renovations, had always felt like a personal affront, but now it was laid bare before her, undeniable. His patio, his fence. They weren't just eyesores, they were illegal. He had built his dream on stolen ground. "This isn't just about the fence," Elaine said, her voice suddenly steady. "This is about him thinking he could erase me, erase this place." Trudy's smile stretched wide, eyes glinting with that familiar spark of mischief. "Time to take that lot back, Elaine, but we need to make it official." Elaine nodded, a calm fury settling deep inside her. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about pride. The years of being overlooked, undervalued, dismissed. Now, she was reclaiming it all. Trudy tapped her fingers on the table. "You need to form an LLC. It'll make things easier when you file the plans for your garden. A reading garden, maybe? Something that makes a statement." Elaine hesitated for a moment, then looked up at her friend. "Something dignified?" Trudy chuckled. "Exactly." "Fine," Elaine said, her lips curling into a smile that had nothing to do with kindness. "Morgan Garden Trust. Let's do it." They spent the next hour carefully going over the details, filling out forms, discussing zoning requirements. Elaine had never thought she'd be sitting here, filling out legal papers for something that would change her life. But as the pieces fell into place, as Trudy and Rebecca worked with her to finalize the paperwork, something in Elaine's mind clicked. It was happening. By the time they were done, Rebecca had arranged everything to be filed with surprising speed. "The paperwork will clear faster than you expect," she said, her tone more like a prediction than a reassurance. "We'll make sure this is officially yours." Elaine's heart raced as she stood gathering her things. "And Nathan?" she asked, her voice low. Rebecca met her eyes. "He'll find out soon enough." They walked out together, the hum of the fluorescent lights and the quiet rustle of papers still lingering in the air. As they stepped into the cold, Trudy patted Elaine on the back, a firm, reassuring touch. "You've got this, Elaine. Now we make sure he knows who's really in charge." Elaine didn't answer immediately. She looked across the street at the house next door, her mind turning over the possibilities. Soon, Nathan would have to face the truth. And when he did, it wouldn't just be about land. It would be about everything he had taken for granted. The future, she realized, was already in motion. The morning after filing the paperwork, Elaine stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The wind outside had picked up, swirling snow around like a frenzied dance. The house felt colder today, despite the quilted layers of blankets she'd piled onto the couch. But it wasn't the cold that made her heart beat faster. It was the quiet anticipation building in her chest. She looked across the yard at Nathan's new fence, the modern structure that had once seemed so clean, so perfect. Now it was a symbol of everything she had endured, everything she was about to tear down. The fence had been built too far, crossing over into what was rightfully hers. It wasn't just a boundary marker, it was a declaration. And today, Elaine was going to remind Nathan just how wrong he was. With a determined breath, she pulled on her thick coat, the one that made her feel a little less invisible. She grabbed the envelope she'd prepared the night before, a small but necessary step in her plan. It was a zoning violation notice, official and final. She could already picture Nathan's face when he saw it taped to his fence. Elaine walked outside, the cold biting at her face as she made her way across the yard. Every step felt deliberate, like she was walking towards something much bigger than just a piece of land. When she reached the fence, she carefully affixed the notice, smoothing the paper flat against the wood. The words were clear: zoning violation, encroachment onto lot 1220 Waverly Court. Removal required. She stepped back and surveyed her work, a slight smile tugging at her lips. It was small, but it was a start. And it was his first real reminder of just how much she knew and how much she could do. Just as she was about to turn back, she saw Kara walking across the lawn, her heels clicking sharply against the frozen ground. She was carrying a basket, probably for groceries, her face fixed in the familiar expression of polite disinterest. She stopped short when she saw the notice pinned to the fence, her eyes narrowing as she took in the words. Elaine stayed still, watching her, but said nothing. Kara's gaze flickered to Elaine, then back to the paper, and for a moment, the older woman almost seemed caught off guard. Then, with a flick of her wrist, Kara took the basket and started toward the door, muttering under her breath, "What kind of joke is this?" Elaine waited until Kara was inside before turning back to the house. The job was done, but this was just the beginning. There was still more to come, and she was more than ready. Later that afternoon, as Elaine was trimming the edges of her garden, the one that had been neglected for years but was now brimming with purpose, she heard a knock on the door. She straightened, her back aching from the effort, and walked inside. Miles stood on the doorstep, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, a hesitant look in his eyes. "Hi, Grandma," he said softly. "Hello, sweetie," Elaine smiled, though she didn't move toward him immediately. There was a quiet weight to his presence, as if he could sense something shifting in the air. "What are you doing?" Miles asked, his gaze flicking toward the growing patch of flowers Elaine had started to cultivate in the backyard. Elaine crouched down beside him, her hands resting on her knees as she met his eyes. "I'm making something, Miles," she said, her voice steady and full of resolve. "Something that lasts." He tilted his head, a soft curiosity in his expression. "Like the garden?" Elaine nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting in a faint, secret smile. "Yes, something like that. Something that stays even when everything else changes." Miles watched her for a moment, his small hands fiddling with the zipper of his jacket. Finally, he nodded slowly, as though understanding more than his years should allow. The next morning, Trudy arrived at the house with a sense of purpose that only deepened Elaine's own. The older woman had the map and the surveyor's paperwork in hand. They needed to know just how far Nathan's fence stretched into Elaine's property. "Time for the soil survey," Trudy said with a grin, handing Elaine the papers. "We'll need official proof if we're going to move forward." Elaine took the papers, her fingers brushing against Trudy's with a fleeting sense of solidarity. They were in this together, and that meant everything. As Trudy made arrangements with the surveyor over the phone, Elaine looked back at the house next door, at Nathan's pristine facade. His remodel was supposed to be the symbol of his success, of his fresh start. But all Elaine could see now was a house built on stolen ground. By the afternoon, Elaine was sitting on the porch when the text came through from Rebecca. It was short, but the words made her pulse quicken. "The zoning office has granted an official pause on Nathan's remodel until further review." Elaine's breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't move. This was it. The first real victory. Nathan would be forced to stop, forced to confront everything he had overlooked. She let the message sit there for a moment longer, her fingers gripping the phone tighter as she stared out at the house next door. He had no idea what was coming next. Elaine stood at the kitchen window, watching as the first of the workers arrived. They drove in under a pale sky, their trucks rumbling down the long, snow-packed road. The familiar hum of machinery, saws, bulldozers, graders, began to fill the air, a sound that had once filled her with dread. Today, it sounded like victory. She pulled her coat tighter, stepped outside, and walked toward the workers assembling on her land. It had been weeks since she'd filed the zoning violation notice, but now it was happening. Right here, right now. They were clearing the land, grading it, preparing it for something new. Something that would prove she hadn't been forgotten. The crew didn't speak much to her. They didn't need to. Their orders had come from the zoning office. The paperwork had been filed. The land she still owned was going to become something more. A small public reading garden, a statement of resilience. A quiet rebuke to the house next door that had once felt like an insurmountable symbol of her son's rejection. She looked back at Nathan's house, now visible behind the clearing trees. The sleek new fence, the stone patio, his dream home. It was all still there, untouched. But soon, it would have to face something different, something grounded. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Elaine!" Kara stormed out of Nathan's front door, her heels cracking against the icy driveway, a flush of anger turning her cheeks redder than the cold could. "What is this?" she spat, flinging a hand toward the workers who were carefully measuring the boundaries of the land Elaine had claimed back. "This is harassment." Elaine didn't flinch. She simply stood there watching Kara's fury play out like some angry animal trying to reclaim ground it had already lost. "Harassment?" Elaine repeated with a soft smile that barely touched her eyes. "No, Kara, this is zoning law." Kara's jaw clenched, her hand trembling as she pointed toward the workers. "You think this is going to stop him?" she demanded. "Nathan has every right to this property. This is just petty." Elaine tilted her head, the sharp cold air biting at her skin as she met Kara's gaze. "You really think this is about Nathan, don't you?" Kara opened her mouth to respond, but Elaine was already turning back toward the workers. It wasn't about Nathan. It was about Elaine taking back what was hers. It was about him. About all of them. Finally realizing that she had power too. As the workers continued their work, Elaine moved to the edge of the yard where the small garden was beginning to take shape. It was simple. A few rows of flowers, carefully planted, a humble beginning. Miles appeared beside her, bundled up in his jacket, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Can I help?" he asked, his voice soft, almost unsure. Elaine smiled, her heart swelling with something that almost felt like pride. "Yes, sweetie, you can help plant these." Miles knelt beside her, his small hands trembling a little as he carefully placed the flowers in the soil. The rhythm of their work, the soft crunch of dirt under their fingers, was like something out of a dream. A dream that had been years in the making. When the first row was done, Miles leaned back on his heels, wiping a spot of dirt from his cheek with his sleeve. "Are we making it look like the garden you told me about?" he asked. Elaine paused, looking at the small patch of earth they'd transformed. "Yes," she said softly. "This is just the beginning." It was then that her phone buzzed in her pocket. Elaine stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, and pulled it out. The number on the screen was familiar. Nathan. She stared at it for a moment, her finger hovering over the screen. Then she let it ring out, her thumb swiping left to reject the call. Nathan could wait. A moment later, another message came through, this time from Rebecca. "Nathan's permits are under review. He's going to have to stop everything until the issue is resolved." Elaine felt a strange stillness settle over her as she read the words. Rebecca had come through. The garden, the very thing that had started as a simple reclaiming of space, was now an unstoppable force. Her land was cleared. Her garden was growing. And now, Nathan's remodel, his dream home, his symbol of moving forward, was on pause. Elaine closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything shift, the quiet triumph building within her. But as she opened them again, a faint sound caught her attention. It was Nathan, standing in the doorway of his house, his figure framed by the stark whiteness of the snowstorm behind him, his eyes locked onto hers. She couldn't hear his words, but his lips moved, forming shapes, questions, maybe, or accusations. She didn't respond. Instead, she simply stood tall, her face unreadable, as the workers continued to move and reshape the land that had always been hers. Nathan's dream had just hit its first roadblock, and Elaine had just begun to build something of her own. Elaine sat at the kitchen table, the letter unfolded in front of her, its words still lingering in the air, thick with a mix of disbelief and quiet rage. Nathan's handwriting was neat, the words cold and calculated. "We no longer require your assistance," it began. "Your presence is no longer needed in our lives. It's time for you to step aside." The letter was more than just a dismissal. It was an erasure, a decision to sever ties, a declaration of her irrelevance in his life. But she wasn't irrelevant. She wasn't going anywhere. The edges of the paper crinkled slightly under her fingers as she reread the lines for what felt like the 100th time. It had been over a week since the letter had arrived, since Nathan had decided to make his words official. But it still felt fresh, sharp as a knife. Still, there was a certain cold satisfaction in knowing that the one thing Nathan had never anticipated was that she'd keep it. Not tear it up, not burn it, but keep it. Every word. She stood, smoothing the letter out carefully and wrapped it in a thick frame. It wasn't a letter of regret or apology. It wasn't a thing of shame, either. It was the document that proved everything she'd known about him, Everything she'd been forced to swallow all these years. Trudy arrived just in time, pushing open the door with that quick, purposeful step of hers. Elaine looked up, the frame still in her hands. "You still got that letter?" Trudy asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Elaine nodded without a word, handing it over to her friend. Trudy studied it for a moment, her eyes scanning the words. A laugh, soft but genuine, escaped her lips as she looked up. "Well, that's a piece of work," she said, shaking her head. Elaine's lips twitched at the corners. "It certainly is." Trudy flipped it over, inspecting the back. "Are you planning to just keep it in a drawer somewhere? Or are you going to make something of it?" Elaine didn't hesitate. She took the letter back, turned, and walked over to the corner of the room where the freshly mounted wooden frame of the microlibrary stood. It wasn't much yet, just a simple structure, half finished, but it was hers. Everything about it was hers. She mounted the letter carefully, making sure it hung exactly where it needed to be. Then, with a steady hand, she placed a small plaque underneath it. The words were simple, but they meant everything. Abandoned doesn't mean forgotten. Trudy stood back, her arms crossed, taking in the sight. "You're really doing it, huh?" she said, her voice full of pride. "This is bigger than just a garden, Elaine. You're creating something that matters." Elaine didn't look at her friend, didn't need to. "I'm not just making a garden," she said, her voice steady. "I'm creating a space that says no one gets to erase me." Miles appeared in the doorway just then, his eyes wide as he took in the library space. His gaze fell on the framed letter, his small brow furrowing in confusion. He stepped closer, studying it for a moment, and then looked up at Elaine. "Grandma," he asked, his voice hesitant, "he really wrote that?" Elaine smiled softly, kneeling down to meet him at eye level. "Yes, sweetie," she said, her tone calm and reassuring. "He wrote it. And now it's part of the story. A story that doesn't end with him thinking I was ever gone." Miles blinked, then tilted his head. "It's like a lesson?" "Exactly," Elaine replied, feeling something warm and steady settle in her chest. "A lesson. For everyone." The doorbell rang, breaking the stillness of the moment. Elaine stood, giving Trudy a brief glance before answering the door. Rebecca stood outside, her face lit by the soft glow of the afternoon sun. "Good timing," Elaine said, stepping aside to let her in. Rebecca nodded, her eyes scanning the library as she entered. "I see you've been busy," she remarked with a smile, her gaze landing on the framed letter. Elaine chuckled softly. "I've been making something that lasts." Rebecca nodded approvingly, looking at the library, at the plans Elaine had drawn up. "The zoning office cleared your design updates. Everything's approved. We're moving forward." Elaine's heart skipped a beat. "So it's official?" "Official enough," Rebecca said with a grin. "It's going up. The garden, the library, everything. And I think it's going to make a statement." Elaine's gaze shifted to the space where the first rows of flowers were beginning to take root. Her heart swelled with something she hadn't expected. Pride, satisfaction, maybe even relief. But most of all, it was a feeling of power. The kind of power that didn't need to shout, didn't need to be loud. It was quiet, subtle, and undeniable. Later that afternoon, the final touch was added. Workers arrived to install the mural on the side of the micro-library. The image was simple, an open book, its pages fluttering in the wind, a few lines of text beneath it. "Abandoned doesn't mean forgotten." Elaine stood back, watching as the mural was carefully mounted. It wasn't just paint on a wall. It was the culmination of everything she had fought for. The reclamation of her land, of her voice, of her place in the world. Nathan, for all his success, hadn't expected this. And Elaine? Elaine had built something much stronger than a house or a fence. She had built a home that would last. The for sale sign appeared on the lawn at 1218 Waverly Court a few days after the mural was finished. Elaine stood at her kitchen window, the familiar chill of the room surrounding her, as she gazed at the sign, its bright red letters stark against the dull gray of the sky. It was a quiet announcement, the kind that carried a weight far greater than its simplicity. No grand farewell, no explanation. It was just a sign. Elaine didn't flinch. She didn't rush to the window like a woman about to tear down the walls of her own house. She stayed still, watching as the wind shifted the sign slightly, like it was whispering to her. The house next door had always felt like an anchor to everything she couldn't have, everything she was made to sacrifice. But now, as Nathan and Kara packed up their life, moving without a word to her, the silence felt different. It felt final. She didn't let herself feel the sting of abandonment this time. Not when she'd learned so much. Not after everything that had come before. The house that had once been the heart of her world, the place that held the last of her old life, was now just another memory to file away. From the corner of her eye, she saw Miles coming down the path to her door. He was bundled up against the cold, a big scarf wrapped around his neck, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. He had been visiting more often lately, slipping over in the afternoons like he was looking for something. Elaine wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the space that the library had become, or the quiet, steady rhythm of their time together. Either way, she welcomed it. Always. He knocked softly on the door, peeking his head inside as Elaine opened it. "Grandma?" he asked, looking toward the window where the for sale sign stood. Elaine smiled at him, her voice calm. "It's just a sign, sweetheart. They're leaving." Miles looked up at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Are we going to still see them?" Elaine crouched down to meet him at eye level, gently pulling him into a hug. "We'll see," she said, letting the quiet weight of the words settle in the space between them. "But you've got a lot of books to help me with here, huh?" Miles grinned, and for a moment, all the shadows of the past few weeks seemed to lift. "I want to help you shelve them, Grandma. Can I?" Elaine's heart warmed. "Of course. I've got plenty for you to do." The days passed quickly after that. The library space was slowly growing, bit by bit. More shelves went up. The flowers outside bloomed, and with every passing moment the weight of the life Elaine had built without Nathan seemed to lessen. It wasn't a replacement. It was just something she had made for herself. And that was enough. But still, the house next door sat empty. Nathan's absence was an echo, a silence that stretched too long. Elaine found herself in the kitchen late one evening, organizing a few papers, when the phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up without thinking, a small note of curiosity tugging at her. It was from Trudy. "You're more public than the mayor right now. You know that?" Elaine's lips curled slightly. Trudy was never one for excessive praise, but the words felt right. The invitation Trudy had been teasing had finally arrived, an invitation to speak at the Hearthlight Women's panel. It was an honor, no doubt. But more than that, it felt like another quiet triumph, the kind that came with no fireworks but every bit of recognition she had long since stopped expecting. Elaine looked out the window at the still, darkened house next door, where the moving trucks had long gone. She wasn't angry, not anymore. She just felt steady, grounded. A week later, the Hearthlight Women's panel arrived in full swing. Elaine arrived early, a little nervous, but something inside her felt steady. As she entered the venue, she was immediately surrounded by an air of gentle respect, the kind that made her feel both a part of something bigger and incredibly small at the same time. There were other women here, women who had made something of themselves, who had fought and built and struggled like her. But this wasn't about them. It was about her. The small moments. The quiet wins. She stood at the podium, looking out at the audience, her heart surprisingly calm. When she spoke, her voice was steady, the words clear and measured. You don't always get to decide the things that happen to you, but you do get to decide how to live with them. I've spent my life waiting for someone else to see me, to hear me, but I've learned that the most powerful thing you can do is build something on your own terms. The audience responded with a soft, knowing murmur, the kind of acknowledgement that meant more than applause. It was the kind of connection that couldn't be faked. When the panel ended, Trudy found her in the hallway, leaning against a wall with a grin on her face. "I told you," she said, giving Elaine a playful nudge. "You're practically a local hero now." Elaine chuckled, her chest light. "I don't know about that," she said, glancing around at the women gathering around her. "But I think I'm starting to believe I've got something worth sharing." Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Rebecca. "The zoning board has received the final design for the garden. We're all set to begin construction." Elaine smiled, staring down at her phone. Everything was falling into place. Nathan's house might be sold, but this was her time now. This was her moment. Elaine stood at the podium, the dim light of the Hearthlight Community Center casting a soft glow on her. The audience was smaller than she expected, but it was enough. Women filled the room, their eyes focused, attentive, some nodding, others leaning forward as if hanging on to each word she said. The air was thick with a quiet understanding, a shared weight of lives lived with sacrifice and strength. She took a breath, steadying herself. This moment was hers. It wasn't about Nathan. It wasn't about anyone but the women who sat in front of her. The ones who, like her, had spent too much time being forgotten. "They forget us," Elaine began, her voice clear and calm. "Then they need our blueprints." A murmur rippled through the room, and she saw the women nodding, each word resonating, stirring something deep within them. She continued, her tone rising with the quiet power of experience. "They forget us when we're quiet, when we're in the background, when we're holding things together without ever asking for recognition. But when it suits them, they come to us. They come for the very things they've ignored. The knowledge, the wisdom, the strength." A woman in the front row, her eyes tired but full of recognition, wiped away a tear. The small, almost imperceptible gesture stopped Elaine for a moment. She wasn't here to stir sympathy, but in this room, she could feel the weight of shared stories, the unspoken history that bound them. Elaine paused, letting the silence settle. "I've built something here," she said softly but firmly, "and it's mine. It's not for anyone else to take. It's not about who left or who didn't see me. It's about what I've created when no one was watching." The words hung in the air, but they didn't fall. They settled gently into the hearts of the women around her. There was no applause, no immediate reaction, only a quiet hum of understanding. After the speech, Elaine stepped down from the podium, her chest light, but her thoughts heavy with the weight of what she'd said. She wasn't sure when she had become the person to speak on these terms, to share her life like it was a blueprint for others to follow. But now it felt natural. She belonged in this space. It felt like the culmination of everything she had built, not just the library, but the years of quiet work she'd put into reclaiming herself. As she moved through the crowd, a woman with a notepad approached her, her eyes eager, her pen ready. Elaine didn't mind. She smiled, prepared to answer whatever question would come. "You're Elaine Morgan, right?" the journalist asked, her voice light but professional. "Yes, that's me," Elaine replied, her smile a little less guarded now. "I was at the panel. Your speech? It really resonated," the journalist said, flipping open her notepad. "Could I get a photo? Maybe an interview? We're doing a feature on local women who've been making a difference. You're, well..." You're one of the most inspiring stories we've come across. Elaine hesitated, just for a moment. Then, she nodded. Of course. The flash of the camera startled her, but it was nothing compared to the strange peace she felt as she stood there, her arms crossed, looking just the way she'd always wanted to look. Confident, steady, and unshakable. Later that evening, Elaine sat in the warmth of her kitchen, the clink of tea stirring in her mug breaking the silence. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the window where the last light of the day was fading. It was Trudy. You made the paper? Trudy's message read. Rooted and rising. I like it. You should too. Elaine smiled to herself, her fingers pausing above the screen. Rooted and rising. She'd never thought of it that way, but it was true. She was rooted in everything she had survived, and now she was rising. The phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from the local newspaper's online edition. She opened it, and there it was, a photo of her, standing tall at the podium, her expression steady, with the headline beneath it, Rooted and Rising, the story of Elaine Morgan, a woman who reclaimed her voice and her land. She stared at it for a long moment, the weight of the past few months hitting her all at once. This was it. This was the public recognition she hadn't asked for, but had earned. A small noise caught her attention from the doorway, and she looked up to see Miles standing there, his arms full of books. Grandma, can we do story hour now? He asked, his face a mix of hope and excitement. Elaine smiled warmly, setting the phone down. Of course, sweetie. Let's get started. The next afternoon, as she settled into the routine of story hour with a group of young children, the sound of laughter and little feet running between the rows of shelves filled the library. Miles had invited a few of his friends from school, and they all seemed drawn to the space Elaine had created. It wasn't just about the books, it was about the community, the garden outside, the library inside. It was all a foundation. One she would continue to build, quietly, without asking for permission. As the children gathered around her, eager for the next story, Elaine felt the familiar rush of warmth fill her chest. The library was open, her voice had been heard. And this time, she was not going anywhere. Elaine sat at her kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling in front of her, the flicker of the candlelight casting soft shadows on the walls. Her phone lay next to her, its silence almost a comfort. But it hadn't been long before it buzzed. An email from Rebecca. She opened it slowly, the words on the screen crisp and simple. Nathan's lawyer has quietly withdrawn the case. For a moment, Elaine didn't move. Her fingers gripped the phone, but the weight of the words didn't quite sink in. All this time, all the years she had spent waiting for someone to recognize her, to see her. And now, the very thing she'd been fighting for was here. The case had been Nathan's last move, his final attempt to claim the land she had once shared with him. But now, it was over. Quietly, without fanfare. He had blinked. She hadn't. Elaine set the phone down and stood up, her body light despite the sudden rush of relief. She walked over to the small desk where she kept her filing system. The drawer slid open with a soft squeak, and she pulled out the letter. The one Nathan had sent. The one she'd kept, framed, for so long. The same letter that had driven her to reclaim what was hers. She dropped the letter into a folder, one she'd labeled dead air months ago. The weight of it seemed less now. Lighter, like it had become just another scrap of paper. Something that no longer held any power over her. Elaine closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer. The sound of the drawer clicking shut felt final, like the last page of a chapter that had taken far too long to turn. The next morning, the library was busier than usual. The small community that had been drawn to the space over the past few months had finally taken notice of what she had built. As children ran between the shelves, their laughter filling the room, Elaine felt a small thrill of satisfaction. This was what she had worked for. This was what was real. Miles had invited a few of his friends, their voices high and excited as they whispered and pointed at the bookshelves. They were in awe, not just of the books, but of the garden outside, the quiet sanctuary that Elaine had created, a place where no one could tear her down. Elaine moved through the room, her steps steady, her heart full. This was her victory. No one could take this from her. The walls of the library, the books, the flowers outside, all of it was a testament to what she had made when the world had turned its back on her. Trudy appeared at the door, smiling wide as she stepped inside. She looked around, her eyes taking in the buzz of activity. The children gathered around the story corner, the soft hum of the space Elaine had created. "You did it, didn't you?" Trudy said, her voice low but full of pride. She leaned against the bookshelf, her arms crossed as she watched the children. Elaine smiled back, the satisfaction of the moment sinking in. "I did." "You know," Trudy added with a knowing grin. "He blinked." "You didn't." Elaine nodded, but there was no smugness in her reply. There was just the quiet strength of a woman who had reclaimed everything she'd once thought lost. Later that afternoon, as Elaine sat at her desk in the back corner of the library, she saw the unmistakable flash of her phone screen, a text from Kara. Elaine opened it hesitantly, already knowing what it would say. "I've blocked you. Don't ever contact me again." She felt nothing. The message was impersonal, almost detached. She stared at the words for a moment, and then she let out a quiet breath. There was no anger, no feeling of betrayal. Just indifference. She set the phone down and glanced out the window at the garden, where the flowers bloomed proudly despite the cold. Nathan's absence, Kara's final move, it was all behind her now. She had already let go of the need for closure, already found peace in what was hers. Miles appeared again, this time with a group of friends following closely behind. They were bouncing off each other, their energy contagious. Miles ran up to her, a wide grin on his face. "Grandma, look at the garden," he said, almost out of breath. "It's awesome. All the kids are talking about it. They said it's the best part of the whole library." Elaine bent down to his level, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "I'm glad you like it, sweetie." "I love it," he said, giving her a quick hug. "I love your garden, Grandma." And in that moment, with the sound of the children's laughter filling the space around her, Elaine felt a deep, undeniable peace. She had built this, built a space where her voice was heard, her life was hers, and no one could take it from her. Nathan, Kara, they didn't matter anymore. They were ghosts, shadows of a past that had already moved on. She looked around the library, her eyes falling on the shelves she had filled with so much care, the stories that had become a part of her own. Miles and his friends had already begun to pull books off the shelves, the room filled with their excited chatter. Elaine stood there for a moment, watching it all, before turning to file away the last bit of the past into its rightful place. Elaine sat in the quiet corner of the library, a mug of tea cooling in front of her, the soft hum of the space surrounding her. It was a quiet afternoon, the sun filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. The laughter of children was faint now, their footsteps echoing in the background as they played outside in the garden she had tended with her own hands. It was a place of peace, a place that had become her anchor. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message from Nathan, or Kara, or anyone from the past. It was a podcast notification. Voices You Tried to Silence. The title caught her attention. She opened the app, and the first thing that popped up was a new episode featuring none other than herself. The description was simple. Elaine Morgan shares her story of reclaiming her voice, her land, and her place in the world. A woman who built a home and a future after being forgotten by those she loved. She smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and disbelief. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected anyone to care about her story, to want to hear it, let alone to turn it into a public conversation. She tapped play, her voice coming through the speaker with a calm, steady assurance she hadn't known she'd found until now. As the episode played, she listened to herself recounting the years of silence, the moments of giving up, and finally, the moment of standing up. Not just for her land, but for herself. The comments began to flood in almost immediately. "Thank you for sharing your story, Elaine. You gave me the courage to start over. I've felt invisible for so long, this was like hearing my own voice. This is the kind of story we need to hear more of." Elaine set the phone down, her chest tight. She wasn't looking for applause, but it was still overwhelming to see it. Real people, real lives, moved by what she had created. By the time the podcast ended, a few volunteers had already shown up at the library, ready to lend a hand. They had heard the podcast too, and now they were here, asking how they could help with the expansion. Some offered to paint, others brought bookshelves, and one woman even offered to help with fundraising. The energy in the room shifted, and the library, her library, began to grow, blossoming into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. By the end of the afternoon, a familiar voice rang out from the doorway. "You know," Trudy said, grinning as she stepped into the room, "you're more famous than the mayor now." Elaine chuckled, her eyes scanning the bustling space. The garden was now more than just her vision. It was becoming a community hub, a place where everyone had a part to play. People were coming, staying, helping, giving. It wasn't about what Nathan had tried to take. It was about what she had built. She had created something that was now growing far beyond her, touching others in ways she couldn't have predicted. Trudy walked over to her, her eyes glinting with that mischievous spark that had always made Elaine feel like anything was possible. "You didn't even have to raise your voice, Elaine," she said. "You just built it." Elaine shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I guess I did." Later that evening, after the volunteers had left and the library was quieter again, Elaine sat down at her desk and opened her email. There, sitting at the top of her inbox, was a message from Rebecca. She clicked it open, and her eyes widened as she read the words. "The city's approved funding for 2 more micro-libraries. We'd like you to spearhead the project, Elaine. You've built something truly remarkable." Elaine leaned back in her chair, the weight of the words settling over her. The city, her city, was acknowledging what she had done. They saw it. They saw her. She clicked reply, typing her response quickly. "I'm in." The next day, Elaine stood in front of the counter of the local paint store, picking out colors. The walls of her library were bare in places, waiting for a fresh coat to match the new beginning. She had already chosen the hues, a soft green to complement the garden outside, a warm yellow to brighten the room, and a deep blue for the corners of the reading nook where children sat on pillows, reading quietly. As the cashier bagged her purchases, Elaine felt the hum of a new chapter stirring inside her. This was only the beginning. Weeks passed, and the library began to fill with even more life. The new volunteers returned, and slowly, with their help, Elaine expanded the space. The community began to buzz with the excitement of new projects, new ideas. Elaine was more than just a librarian now. She was a beacon for anyone who had ever felt lost or overlooked. Her work was featured in the local news, her photo appearing on a bright, smiling front-page article. A photo of her standing outside the micro-library, surrounded by children and volunteers, with the headline, "Rooted and Rising, Elaine Morgan's Legacy in Maple Hollow." It was everything she had ever wanted and nothing she had ever expected. She had fought for herself, for her land, for her voice. And now she was creating something that could never be taken from her. A home built of books, of memories, of resilience. As she closed the library doors one evening, her hand resting on the worn wood, she couldn't help but smile. Elaine stood at the kitchen window once again, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. The sight was familiar, peaceful, quiet, as it had always been. But today the house next door seemed different. Nathan's house, the one that had been such a fixture in her life, was empty now. No more sounds of laughter or footsteps, no more familiar hum of life behind those walls. Moving vans lined the street, their heavy tires digging into the soft earth of Waverly Court. A silent procession of things packed up, memories folded away, and another chapter closed. Nathan and Kara were leaving without a word. There were no goodbyes, no acknowledgements. Just the quiet shuffling of furniture, a few words exchanged between the movers, and a door that shut one last time. Elaine didn't feel anger or sadness. Instead, there was just a heavy stillness. She watched, her hand resting on the windowsill, as the last of the furniture was loaded into the trucks. The only sound was the occasional creak of wood as it was hauled up the ramp and into the van. It felt like watching the final remnants of a past she'd outgrown. Miles came into the kitchen, his jacket hanging loosely from his shoulders, a grin lighting up his face. He glanced out the window, his gaze following hers. "They're really gone, huh?" he asked, his voice soft, almost like he wasn't sure how to feel about it. Elaine nodded, her eyes still on the trucks as they pulled away. "They are. I'll still visit you, Grandma. I'll keep coming by, okay?" Miles promised, his eyes wide with sincerity. Elaine turned to face him, a smile tugging at her lips. "I know you will, sweetheart. You don't have to promise me that. I know." Miles's grin widened, and for a moment, Elaine felt a warmth flood through her. A feeling of relief, like the last pieces of her life were finally aligning. She wasn't alone, and she wouldn't be. The days after Nathan and Kara's departure felt quieter, more settled. The house across the street stood empty, a stark reminder of everything that had happened. Elaine found herself standing in the yard more often, watching the space, knowing it was hers in a way it never had been before. One afternoon, she stepped out with a small bag of lavender seedlings in her hand. The garden outside had flourished, but something about that empty space, the spot where Nathan's fence had once stood, demanded something more. Lavender, she thought. Something simple and soothing, a symbol of healing, of growth. She kneeled down, her fingers brushing the soil, planting the lavender with care. The scent of the earth filled her senses, grounding her in a way nothing else could. When she stood back up and looked at the small patch of purple, a sense of satisfaction spread through her. It wasn't just a garden, it was her statement, her reclamation. As she worked, she heard footsteps approaching, the soft patter of shoes on the gravel path. Looking up, she saw a family standing at the gate. A man and woman, their 2 young children bouncing excitedly at their sides. "Excuse me," the woman called out, her voice hesitant. "I hope we're not interrupting, but we just moved in next door." She gestured to the house that had once belonged to Nathan. "We've been admiring your garden for a while. Would you mind if we helped with it? I've always wanted to plant some flowers." Elaine smiled, the warmth spreading through her chest again. It felt like an offering, like this new family was stepping into something she had made, something she had given life to. "I'd love the help," Elaine said. "I'm planting lavender here today. Would you like to join me?" The woman's face brightened, her eyes alight with excitement. "We'd love to." A few weeks passed, and the garden became a meeting place. The new neighbors came by often, helping Elaine with small tasks, planting more flowers, arranging the benches under the trees. The children played in the yard, their laughter blending with the sound of rustling leaves. The once quiet, neglected space was now alive with energy, with life. Elaine watched it all, her heart full. She had created something beautiful, something that would grow long after she was gone. She had made a place where people could come together, where they could find peace, just like she had. The past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. This garden, this space, was what would last. One afternoon, as the children ran through the garden, their laughter echoing around her, Elaine stood with a shovel in her hand, adding a few final touches to the flower beds. She smiled to herself, content. The kids had started calling her Miss E after a few visits. It was a small thing, but it meant so much to her. The title felt like something she had earned, something that tied her to this new chapter in her life. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a message from Trudy. "I'm coming by tomorrow to check on the garden. Also, heard the mayor is planning to do a photo op there next week. Seems like you're becoming quite the local landmark." Elaine chuckled softly as she put the phone down. She had no intention of becoming a celebrity, but she couldn't deny the strange satisfaction of knowing that what she had built was being recognized. As she turned back to the garden, her eyes fell on the young family next door, their kids running between the rows of flowers, their voices full of joy. For the first time in years, Elaine didn't feel the weight of what had been taken from her. Instead, she felt the quiet power of what she had created. She had found her place. No one could take that away. Elaine stood in the middle of the second micro-library, the space just beginning to take shape. The walls were freshly painted, the shelves empty, waiting to be filled with books. The sunlight filtered in through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. Outside, the garden was still in its infancy, but the plan was clear. This place, like the one in Maple Hollow, would become a refuge, a gathering space. A symbol of something more than just bricks and mortar. As she watched the workers adjust the final details, her mind drifted back to the first time she had stood in her own library, the one she had built from scratch. The journey to this point had felt long, but now, standing here, it felt almost inevitable. The blueprint she had created for herself had become something much bigger than just one house, one garden. It had become a movement. In the months since her own garden had taken root, other towns had begun reaching out. They'd heard her story. They'd seen the garden, the community, and the transformation. 2 neighboring towns had asked her for help replicating her project, and now, the second site was almost ready to open. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Rebecca, the zoning officer turned ally, her message simple but laden with meaning. "The state has approved your blueprint. It's official. Your state endorsed now." Elaine paused, letting the words settle in. State endorsed. It wasn't just an accomplishment, it was a stamp of legitimacy, a formal recognition of something that had started with nothing more than a few flowers planted in a neglected lot. The recognition wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had stepped into that garden and made it a living, breathing thing. A community was born, not out of necessity, but of possibility. The launch day arrived quickly. The ribbon was cut, the speeches were made, and the first group of children entered the new micro-library, their excitement palpable. As Elaine stood by, watching the scene unfold, her heart swelled. This was it. This was the fruit of years of labor, not just in building a library, but in rebuilding herself. Trudy was beside her, tears in her eyes, wiping them with the back of her hand. "You've done it, Elaine," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe you've done it. This is bigger than we ever imagined." Elaine smiled, her hand resting on her friend's shoulder. She hadn't expected the tears, but seeing them made the whole thing feel real in a way it hadn't before. She'd done this. And it wasn't just her. It was all of them. It was everyone who had helped. Everyone who believed when no one else did. Rebecca stood a little farther off, watching the scene with a satisfied grin. She approached, her hands in her pockets, her eyes glinting with pride. "You just outlasted him, Elaine, all the way to the finish line." Elaine turned to her, the weight of the moment settling in. She had outlasted Nathan, outlasted everyone who had ever doubted her, but that wasn't the goal. It was never about outlasting anyone. It had always been about building something that would outlast the past, something that would stay. "That was never the goal," Elaine said quietly. "Just the result." Rebecca nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "And look at what you've built. This is something that will keep going, long after all the noise has faded." Elaine turned back to the crowd, the faces of the children, the families, the volunteers. The garden was more than just flowers now. It was a home for the community, a testament to what had been built from nothing. Later that afternoon, as the crowds began to thin and the noise of celebration started to settle, Elaine stood quietly beside one of the new benches in the garden. The plaque she had ordered had been mounted on a large stone beside it, its words simple, but full of meaning: "Born of silence, rooted in respect." She ran her fingers over the plaque, the cool surface grounding her in the moment. The words reflected everything she had fought for, everything she had built. They were the words that encapsulated her journey, her transformation from a woman who had been erased to one who had reclaimed everything she had lost. She stood there for a moment, alone with her thoughts, before the sounds of laughter and excited voices drifted back to her. The new families were exploring, some of the children running in and out of the library, their smiles bright and carefree. As she watched them, her heart swelled once more, but there was a quiet peace in her chest now. The battle had been fought. The past had been put to rest, and this was her new beginning. Elaine smiled, turning back to the entrance of the library. This was just one part of the journey. There was so much more to come. Elaine sat at her desk, the soft murmur of the library in the background, her fingers poised over the keyboard. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of pages and the faint echo of laughter from the children outside. She hadn't expected it to be like this, hadn't expected the sense of calm to settle so deeply in her chest after everything that had happened. But here she was, her heart full, her space finally hers. She'd built a life from the remnants of loss, and now, with the garden flourishing outside and the library running smoothly, she felt a pull inside of her. There was more to say, more to tell. The idea had come to her slowly, like a whisper she couldn't ignore. She had always loved writing, but it was the memories, the stories from her past, that had begun to shape the words on the page. She had lived them, fought through them, and now she needed to write them down. She had been thinking about it for weeks, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, the cursor blinking in rhythm with her heartbeat. Today, she was ready. With a soft exhale, she began typing, the lot line. She smiled faintly as the words formed on the screen, the title feeling right, like the opening to a story that had always been there, buried beneath layers of silence. It wasn't just a story about land. It was about boundaries, about how people can try to erase others, to redraw lines to suit themselves, and how the land itself never forgets. The words flowed slowly at first. She wrote about Nathan, about the house they had once shared, the years she had spent trying to hold it all together while everything crumbled around her. She wrote about the land between their homes, the land that had always been hers, the land that Nathan had tried to claim. She wrote about the garden that had become her lifeline, her statement, her reclamation. A week later, Trudy sat beside her at the kitchen table, the first draft of the lot line spread out between them. Elaine had written it quickly, almost like the words were waiting to be set free. Trudy picked through the pages carefully, her eyes scanning the text, occasionally pausing to make a note or underline a sentence. "You've captured it," Trudy said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "This is your story, Elaine. It's raw, it's real, and well, it's the kind of thing that needs to be shared." Elaine felt a twinge of pride. She had written it all. The pain, the anger, the quiet strength. There was nothing left to hide now. Trudy smiled at her, handing back the manuscript. "Just a few edits, and you've got yourself a book." Elaine nodded, but her heart was light. She knew what it meant now. It was more than just a cathartic exercise. It was a declaration. The past was finally in print, and it wasn't just for her anymore. It was for everyone who had ever felt silenced, everyone who had ever been ignored. A month later, Elaine stood in the library, flipping through the pages of the proof of her book. The lot line. It was real now. It had been picked up by a small publisher, and she felt a rush of excitement as she ran her fingers over the glossy cover. Miles had even contributed illustrations, simple sketches of the garden, of the lot between their houses, of the moment she had stood at the edge of the garden, watching it all change. His drawings brought a sense of innocence to the book, the way a child might see something beautiful without knowing the struggle that had come with it. She had added a final page, one that had always been part of the plan. She had written, "I didn't leave. They did." It was her truth, her statement, the final line that tied everything together. As she prepared to submit the final manuscript, Elaine couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. It wasn't just the garden or the library, it was this book. It was her story told in her words, finally shared with the world. Weeks passed, and Elaine's world grew busier. The library thrived, the garden expanded, and the press surrounding the lot line began to grow. The story of the woman who had reclaimed her voice, her land, and her life became a local sensation. More articles, more interviews, and even national recognition. Elaine's face appeared in a senior living magazine, a glossy spread highlighting her transformation. The caption beneath her smiling photo read, "Elaine Morgan, a life reclaimed, a story told." She looked at the magazine in her hands, marveling at how far she had come. The woman in the photo wasn't the same one who had stood on the porch all those years ago, watching Nathan and Kara walk away. This was a woman who had found her place, who had built something that would last, no matter what had come before. And then, her phone buzzed again. A new message. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat. It was from Nathan. "I saw the magazine article. I know I don't have the right to ask, but can we talk?" Elaine sat there for a long moment, staring at the words on the screen. There were no immediate answers, no quick reactions. She had already built what she needed, what she wanted. She didn't need Nathan to validate her anymore. But there was something about those words that lingered, something about the final chapter that she couldn't quite close. The past was never fully finished, was it? Elaine's fingers hovered over the phone, her heart steady, but her thoughts uncertain. Would she answer? Would she even want to? Elaine stood at the edge of the set, her arms folded loosely as she surveyed the recreated scene. It was uncanny how real it felt. The weathered porch, the faded fence, the overgrown yard. The crew had done their job well. It was as though time had rewound itself, bringing back everything she had fought to leave behind. But now, it was different. It was hers, shaped by her hands and her story, not by the whims of anyone else. The filming had begun just a week ago, and each day she found herself watching, listening, the past unfolding in front of her like a storybook she had once hoped to forget. She had insisted on keeping the filming grounded. No melodrama, no sensationalism. This wasn't about creating a perfect narrative or playing up the heartbreak. This was her truth. Simple, raw, and real. The house they had recreated was no longer just a house. It was the physical manifestation of everything she had lost and gained. Trudy moved quietly behind her, adjusting a small prop with the same precision she had used when they first started putting the garden together. Her eyes shone with the same pride they always had, even when Elaine had doubted herself. "I've never seen anything like this," Trudy murmured, her voice low but full of admiration. "It's strange, watching it all play out like this. You, that house. It's almost like you're reclaiming it all over again." Elaine smiled faintly, not quite sure how to respond. She wasn't sure if it was the act of reliving the past that brought the clarity or if it was simply the act of telling it, but either way, this film wasn't just a movie. It was a message, a reminder that she had survived, that she had built something more lasting than the house ever could be. They shot the scenes in order, one by one. The first was simple: the house, the front door, the letter on the wall, the one Nathan had sent, the one that had spurred her to take control of her life. They recreated it with perfect accuracy, down to the fraying edges of the paper and the ink that had been so coldly written. When they filmed Elaine's younger self reading it, she could almost feel the sting of it again, but this time, the pain had lessened. She had outgrown it. Trudy helped costume the actress playing Elaine's younger self. The woman was a younger version of her, no doubt. But the clothes, the jeans, the worn sweater, the look in her eyes, made Elaine feel as though she was watching a version of herself she had left behind. It was unsettling, in a way, but also strangely liberating. She could feel the distance between herself and the woman on screen, the one who had struggled so silently. Elaine remained behind the camera during the filming, her heart steady but her mind far away. She didn't want to be the center of attention, not now. It wasn't her story to tell with fireworks and grand gestures. It was just her story. Quiet. Unyielding. Miles was there too, running lines between takes. His youthful energy a stark contrast to the scenes they were recreating. He was playing himself after all. Playing the grandson who had come to see the garden grow, who had witnessed the transformation she had gone through. He was no longer a small child, the one she had watched play under the trees. He was older now, more confident, more aware of the weight of the legacy she had built. As the day wound down, and the crew prepared to leave for the night, Elaine noticed Kara's posts on social media. The cryptic messages that seemed to drip with passive aggression. A photo of a garden. A quote about moving on. Elaine clicked the notification, then swiftly swiped it away. She wasn't interested in what Kara had to say. Not anymore. The woman who had once been a part of her family, who had helped shape her son's life, was now nothing more than a shadow from the past. A footnote in a story she had written for herself, without needing anyone's approval. "Are you okay?" Trudy's voice cut through the silence. She was standing beside Elaine, her expression unreadable. Elaine nodded, glancing back at the house. "I'm fine. It's just—" She trailed off, unsure of what to say. Trudy's eyes softened with understanding. "You've come a long way." Elaine took in a deep breath and nodded, her gaze sweeping over the set one last time. "It doesn't even feel like the same place anymore," she said quietly. "It's not about what happened anymore. It's about what I've built, about what I can still create." That night, as Elaine sat in her quiet kitchen, the screen of her phone lit up once more. This time, it wasn't Kara. It was a message from Rebecca, followed by a news notification. The text read, "Elaine, we're getting more attention than expected. The mayor wants to feature your story in a citywide campaign. They're looking at more locations now, Maybe even a state initiative. We're moving beyond just this town. Elaine blinked, the news sinking in slowly. She hadn't expected this, hadn't even thought about it. But here it was. She had started with a single garden, a library. And now, there was something much bigger on the horizon. She set her phone down, her fingers hovering over the screen. The weight of it was immense, but not overwhelming. It wasn't fame she was after. It was something far simpler. The chance to create something that would outlast her, something that would stay long after the noise had died down. Her thoughts drifted to the film, to the journey she had taken and the space she had carved out for herself. It wasn't just the garden. It wasn't just the library. It was the life she had built on her own terms. And now that life was being shared with the world. The past had shaped her. But the future? It was hers to write. Elaine sat at her desk, the final draft of the lot line resting in front of her. The weight of the words she'd written, the story she'd finally told, was heavier than she had expected. But there was something else that still lingered on her mind. The letter from Nathan. The one that had arrived not long after everything had fallen into place. The letter she'd left unopened on the counter. She picked it up now, turning it over in her hands. The envelope was plain, the handwriting familiar, but the silence between them felt too vast to bridge with a single piece of paper. She didn't need to open it. She knew what it was. He'd always known how to ask for forgiveness, how to make her doubt herself. But not anymore. With a sigh, Elaine dropped the letter into the drawer, along with everything else that belonged to the past. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about peace. And she had finally found it. She locked the drawer and slid the key into her pocket. The final chapter closed. Outside, the children's laughter echoed through the trees of the reading garden, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her new life. The little feet running along the paths, the joy of discovery as they ran from bench to bench, their voices filling the space she had created. It was everything she had dreamed of. The garden had become more than just a place for books and stories. It had become a place of belonging, a sanctuary where the weight of the past couldn't reach. Elaine watched from the door as Miles waved to her, his book tucked under his arm, a grin spread across his face. He had become a regular presence in the library, always eager to lend a hand, to show the younger children the joy of a good story. He was growing up so quickly. She stepped outside, walking slowly across the garden, her shoes crunching on the gravel. She waved back at Miles, her heart full of a quiet, steady warmth. This was the future. This was what she had built. When the sun began to set, Elaine unlocked the door of the micro-library, the key turning with a soft click. Inside, the space was bathed in the last golden rays of light, the shelves lined with books, each one a reminder of the journey she had taken. She walked over to the corner where a small candle sat waiting on the table. With a steady hand, she lit it, watching the flame flicker and settle, its soft light casting a glow over the room. It was a simple ritual, but it had become one of her favorites, the quiet moments of peace, the stillness that came after the work was done. She sat in the chair by the window, the candlelight dancing across the walls, and breathed in the calm. The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted her quiet reverie, and soon Trudy stepped through the door, holding 2 mugs of warm cider in her hands. Her face was lit with a grin, as always, and her eyes sparkled with a sense of accomplishment. "You know," Trudy said, setting the mugs on the table, "I've never been prouder of anyone than I am of you. This place, this garden, it's more than just a library. It's a legacy." Elaine smiled, taking a sip of her cider. The warmth of it settled in her chest, matching the peace she felt in the room. "It's a new beginning, Trudy. That's what it is." The 2 women sat in companionable silence, sipping their drinks as the last light of day faded from the windows. The air was thick with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that this space, this moment, was exactly what she had fought for. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. She had found her place, her purpose. A few moments later, Miles appeared in the doorway, his book still in hand. He walked over to the bench by the window, settling into it with a sigh. "Miss E," he said, his voice light but full of meaning. "This place is the best. I love it here." Elaine's heart swelled. She watched him as he opened his book, the familiar joy in his eyes as he turned the pages, lost in the world of stories. She hadn't done this for fame or recognition. She had done it because she believed in the power of a space, a community, a place where stories could be told and shared. A place that could give children like Miles a chance to grow, to be heard. She looked out the window, at the garden in full bloom, the flowers dancing in the evening breeze. As the evening drew to a close, Elaine stepped outside, breathing in the cool air. The stars were beginning to appear in the sky, their light faint but constant, like the garden she had built, quiet, steady, and enduring. Miles waved at her from the window, a book still in hand, and for the first time in a long while, Elaine felt something deep and lasting in her chest. This was it. This was her life now, rooted in the earth, in the books, in the garden, and in the faces of the people she had touched. No more silences. No more erasure. Just the simple, undeniable truth of the space she had built. My son abandoned me in a ruined house. He didn't know who owned the one beside it. And with that, Elaine smiled, knowing that she had finally found the place where she belonged.